What happens when you die? It's a question that has haunted humanity for as long as we've been able to think about the future. From the first humans staring at the stars and wondering about the nature of existence, to modern scientists probing the boundaries of consciousness, the mystery of death has remained unsolved. But why are we so captivated by this question? Is it because we fear death? Or because we sense that understanding it might teach us how to live? So, settle in. We're about to dive deep into one of life's greatest mysteries. What happens when you die? Let's start with a view that many people in the modern world find compelling: the materialist perspective. From this standpoint, death is the end. It's the moment when the biological processes that sustain us cease. Our hearts stop beating, our brains stop firing electrical signals, and our bodies begin to break down. For materialists, consciousness is not some separate, eternal soul. It's a product of the brain, a phenomenon that arises from the intricate dance of neurons, synapses, and chemical reactions. When the brain dies, so too does the self. This idea isn't new. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus argued that death is nothing to us because when we die, we no longer exist to experience anything, neither pain nor pleasure. He said, "Why fear what we cannot feel?" Modern neuroscience builds on this perspective. The brain, it tells us, is like a biological computer. When the power goes out, the program stops running. Consciousness is a byproduct of physical matter, not something that exists beyond it. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If death is truly the end, what does that mean for the meaning of life? Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus argued that life's finitude doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it precious. Camus famously said that we must imagine Sisyphus endlessly rolling his boulder up a hill as happy. Why? Because in the face of death's finality, it's up to us to create our own meaning. Materialism forces us to confront the stark reality of mortality, but it also calls us to embrace life, to treasure the fleeting moments we have and make them count. But not all philosophies see death as an end. In fact, some of the world's oldest traditions view it as part of a cycle, a perpetual rhythm of birth, death, and rebirth. Let's step into the world of Hinduism and Buddhism, where the concept of samsara reigns. Samsara is the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. In this view, death is not a termination but a transition, a bridge from one life to the next. The Bhagavad Gita, one of Hinduism's most revered texts, uses a powerful metaphor to describe this. The soul is like a person changing clothes. When the body becomes worn out, the soul discards it and takes on a new one. Death, then, is no more final than taking off a jacket. Buddhism adds another layer of nuance. Here, it's not the soul that moves from life to life, but rather the energy of your actions, your karma. This energy shapes your next existence. Did you live with kindness and compassion? Or did you sow harm and suffering? Your choices ripple through the universe, influencing what comes next. But Eastern philosophy doesn't stop there. The ultimate goal in both Hinduism and Buddhism is to escape this cycle entirely. For Hindus, it's called moksha, liberation from samsara and unity with the divine. For Buddhists, it's nirvana, a state beyond suffering and desire, where the self dissolves into ultimate peace. These ideas challenge us to think beyond the self. If death is just a chapter in an infinite story, then what matters most is how we live this chapter. How do we navigate the balance between attachment and transcendence? Now, let's turn to another deeply influential idea: the belief that death is a return, a homecoming, a reunion with something greater than ourselves. In many mystical traditions, life is seen as a separation, a temporary departure from a divine source. Death, then, is a return to that source. The Sufi poet Rumi captured this beautifully when he wrote, "Don't be afraid. When the soul leaves the body, it takes flight like a joyful bird set free." Christianity and Islam also speak of death as a transition, but with a distinct emphasis on moral judgment. The Christian tradition describes heaven and hell, destinations determined by how you lived your life. But beyond the imagery of pearly gates and fire, Christianity offers a profound vision of death as a reunion with God's infinite love. In Judaism, death is often seen as a mystery, with the afterlife left intentionally vague. What matters is how you live, your deeds, your kindness, your justice. This mirrors the mystical teachings of Kabbalah, which suggest that death reunites the fragmented soul with its divine origin. Even Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, saw death as a liberation. He believed the soul existed before birth and would continue after death, freed from the imperfections of the physical world. For Plato, life was like a shadow, a pale reflection of the true reality beyond. These perspectives challenge us to think of death not as a loss, but as a transformation. What if death is a return to something more real, more eternal than the life we know? And yet, for some, the most profound possibility is that death brings nothing, no soul, no reunion, just a void. This is the idea that has haunted philosophers like Nietzsche and Sartre, but also empowered them. If death is nothingness, then it's a clean slate. It doesn't threaten us. It frees us. Think of the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, meditated daily on his own mortality. He wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." From this perspective, the fear of death is wasted energy. After all, if death is the end, we'll never know it. The poet Dylan Thomas famously raged against the dying of the light, but perhaps the true challenge is to accept the light's eventual fading and to cherish it while it burns. Modern science has brought fascinating new ideas to the discussion. For example, some physicists suggest that consciousness might not be confined to the brain. Could it be a field, a quantum phenomenon that persists in some form even after death? Even if we vanish from this world, something of us remains: memory. Our lives leave traces, not just in the minds of those who knew us, but in the world we shape. Every action we take, every word we speak, ripples outward. The ancient Greeks had a concept called kleos, the immortality of fame. To be remembered was to live on, even after death. This idea resonates in many cultures, from the ancestor veneration of African traditions to the literary legacies of poets and writers. But memory is not just about being remembered by others. It's about the connections we create, the love we share, the lessons we pass on. Maybe death isn't just about what happens to us. Maybe it's about what we leave behind. To understand death, we need to talk about time. We experience life as a sequence of moments, a past we remember, a present we inhabit, and a future we imagine. But what if time doesn't work the way we think it does? Einstein's theory of relativity tells us that time is not a fixed line, but a fluid dimension. To an observer outside of time, the past, present, and future might exist simultaneously. If that's true, then death isn't the end of our timeline. It's simply a transition to another part of it. This idea echoes in the philosophy of eternalism, which suggests that every moment of our lives, past, present, and future, continues to exist in a timeless realm. From this perspective, when we die, we don't disappear. We remain forever alive in the fabric of time. But what does this mean for the self? Are we bound to a single moment? Or are we something greater, something that transcends the flow of time? Death forces us to confront this paradox. That life feels fleeting, but the essence of who we are might be eternal. Death doesn't discriminate. It comes for kings and beggars, the young and the old, the virtuous and the villainous. From the moment we are born, death walks beside us, a silent companion reminding us of our shared humanity. But different cultures have approached this reality in profoundly unique ways. Take ancient Egypt, where death was not an end but a highly structured process. The Egyptians believed that the soul was judged in the Hall of Ma'at, where your heart was weighed against the feather of truth. A life of goodness and balance ensured eternal peace. A life of selfishness and imbalance led to annihilation. Death, to the Egyptians, was a test, one that revealed the true essence of a person. Contrast that with the Norse. For them, death was not a judgment but a battle. The Norse believed that warriors who died bravely would ascend to Valhalla, a hall of eternal feasting. Those who lived without courage faced a less glorious fate. Death, in this worldview, was an opportunity to prove your strength. How we understand death depends on where we stand in the world. In Japan, for example, death is not something to be feared or avoided. It's woven into the very fabric of life through a concept called shikata jie nai, the acceptance of what cannot be helped. This philosophy encourages people to face death with dignity and serenity, embracing the natural cycle of existence. Among the Aboriginal Australians, death is not seen as an end, but as a return to the dreaming. The dreaming is a timeless dimension where ancestors, land, and spirits are interconnected. To die is to rejoin this eternal web, to become part of the song that shapes the world. Meanwhile, in Mexico, death is celebrated with joy during Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Families gather to honor their ancestors, decorating altars with marigolds, candles, and food. Death here is not a grim specter, but a beloved guest, a reminder that life continues in memory and connection. These cultural perspectives show us something profound. Death is not universal. Its meaning shifts depending on the stories we tell about it. And perhaps, by exploring these stories, we can begin to rewrite our own relationship with mortality. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy cannot be destroyed. So, what happens to the energy that animates us? Does it dissipate into the cosmos, becoming part of something greater? And then there are near-death experiences. Thousands of people report vivid visions during moments when their brains were clinically inactive. Are these just hallucinations? Or do they point to something more profound? Science doesn't yet have answers, but its questions push us to expand our understanding of what's possible. Ultimately, perhaps the greatest lesson of death is not about what happens after. It's about what it teaches us about life. The Japanese philosophy of mono no aware encourages us to find beauty in impermanence. The fleeting bloom of a cherry blossom, the final notes of a song. These things are precious precisely because they don't last. In medieval Europe, the tradition of memento mori, remember you must die, reminded people to live with intention. Each breath, each choice, becomes sacred in the shadow of mortality. As the Stoics taught, death is not something to fear, but something to prepare for. By rehearsing death, by imagining it, facing it, we can learn to live without regret. So, what happens when you die? After all this exploration, we still don't know. And maybe we're not meant to. What we do know is that death is a mirror. It reflects our beliefs, our fears, and our hopes. It forces us to confront life's impermanence and to find meaning in the here and now. The real question isn't what happens when you die. It's what will you do while you're alive? Thank you for joining me on this journey. Stay curious and live fully.